So the first time I encountered Jimi was at Tina's in Dundee. We were having dinner and didn't know him, but was just having dinner with some friends. And David from Tina's came to my table and said, hey, this guy down there at this table is going to interview with you tomorrow for a job at Wilkinson. And I looked around and there was this big monster guy, at least he looked to me like very massive, with his black KGB coat. I found out afterwards there was an old KGB coat, but anyway, very impressive guy. And so I know that I think I shook his hand and just said hi that night. And so that was the first encounter I ever had. And obviously the next day he came for the interview and, we hired him from that day on. So that was my first meeting with Jimi.
I love to talk about Jimi. He's one of the favorite people that I've known in the wine industry, and yet I can't remember when I met him. I can't remember a wine industry world that didn't have Jimi in it. Obviously we've had to imagine that since 2004, but thank God for Janie. She's continued to keep him in the forefront of our minds. I must have met him early on at Wilkinson when he was Laurent Montelieu's assistant winemaker. And I know that there were social situations, especially when Cheryl Francis and Sam Tannehill would be together and drinking wine and other things, where Jimi would be around also.
Do you remember? I mean, I know we went over to Wilkinson.
Yeah.
Is that where we met him at that barbecue?
Yeah, 1996, and I think it was June or
Summer,
something like. It was summer,
yeah, for sure.
because Paco was, it was 6 months old.
That's right.
And we met Jimi, and we were sitting on the. We were sitting outside.
Down below the tasting room on that wall there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was the first time we met him, and he was the assistant winemaker at Wilkinson.
Is that dorky looking guy over there?
No, we sat with him, and he was the new assistant winemaker, and I was the assistant winemaker over at Chehalem, and you were the assistant over at Archery Summit at the time. And we sort of just managed to sit next to him at a certain time and started talking and kept talking and kept talking, and sort of went into the evening with like, wow, he's pretty cool.
Love it first sight.
I think you met him before I did. I met him at the Woodstock Wine and Deli tasting, and there was just this huge personality that came bounding into the room, and I was like, David, who is that guy? And he's like, that's Jimi Brooks. And we became close friends pretty soon after that. When did you first meet him?
Which WWD tasting are you thinking? So I can.
I have no idea what year that was.
Okay. So let's see. Wilkinson's first vintage was 95, which makes me. I want to say that Jimi was there from the beginning, and Jimi and I started to talk and figured out that we knew some of similar people. We didn't know the same people, but he and I had been at high school at the same time. He had gone to Sunset. I had gone to Lincoln, and there had been some crossover. I mean, I knew some people at Sunset at the time, and there had been some rivalries there. So we hit it off early on, and then with the challenges, and to date, even talking to the old guard, the Ted Castilles and the David Lutz and the David Adelsheims, 95 still ranks as Oregon's most challenging vintage. It had ripeness levels of 84, and it had disease challenges that hadn't been seen since 77. So we had a lot of discussions. A lot of us had a lot of discussions in 95 because of the challenges of that vintage.
I don't remember how I met Jimi. It's probably some crazy party somewhere. I really don't. Jimi was a little bit kind of larger than life for me, and I think and he was he was a free spirit, and he was, this kind of avant-garde guy that was doing kind of crazy things, and he was also kind of the cool crowd, he was like the younger, cooler crowd that had come into the Valley. At the point I met him, I think I had 2 kids, and he had Pascal, but somehow he was raising him in a very different way than I was raising my kids. He was super cool. And so I don't remember exactly when I met him. We became friends when we worked together on this project, and it was late, and it was the last year of his life that we really got to know each other, when we were working on this project for IPNC, where we did a fruit swap from DDO, and presented. We each made some wine from the same vineyard and presented it at this IPNC seminar. So we were working together through that season. That's where we really got to know each other, and I realized that he was a very actually thoughtful and sensitive guy, and not just wild and crazy.
Jimmy actually came to our property when I wasn't here, and it was, I believe, it 1999 that he came and visited and went to the greenhouse with one of my guys, and he wanted to meet with me, so he left his card, and that's when after receiving his card, I gave him a call, and so I believe, I invited him to come to our house for dinner after talking with him for a few minutes, and we kind of became friends afterwards. So a lot of times that he was off the work, he would come over our place or come to the property, and we, being kind of like-minded, both of us, we hit it off as far as becoming really good friends. And he later on convinced me that I should start the winery, because at the time I was thinking that I initially would do all the planting, and then years later to do the winery. But he convinced me that it's best that as we were planting, to have a small winery, so people would notice what kind of wine we could produce in order to even be able to sell our fruit.
I met Jimmy, I think it was 1996, and I was, the winery that I was working for, we had arranged to buy some barrels from Willackenzie, where Jimmy was working, and that winery that I worked for was either underfunded or didn't want to fund certain things that I felt were important, and one of those things that was important was the brake system on our flatbed. And I was the one that had to pick up the barrels, and I really didn't want to drive that truck because I didn't think it was safe. And I spent half a day trying to bleed the brake system and make them work well enough to haul a load of barrels, and then set off up to Willackenzie to pick the barrels up. And I got there, and Jimmy was there, so that was the day that I actually first met Jimmy. And so I had my list with X number of barrels to pick up with the barrel numbers, so we could pick them out, and we knew which ones that we're getting. And then Jimmy told me that, well, no, we don't have that many barrels. And I said, well, here's the list. We have barrel numbers and everything. And I noticed that some of the barrels that were set aside were the barrels that I had barrel numbers for. So obviously those barrels had then been promised or sold to someone else. And so I was a little bit annoyed because the number of barrels that they ended up selling to the winery that I was working for, I could have put in the back of a pickup truck and not have driven a flatbed that I felt threatened my life and anyone else who was on the road if the brakes failed. And so we got in a little bit of an argument. And Jimmy said, look, whatever, the classic thing is like, here's my packing list, there's the barrel numbers, they're right there, so I'd like to load them. And Jimmy's a little bit bigger than me, and argued a little bit, but realized that what's the point? You know, they're not going to sell us the barrels, and there's no point in arguing, especially with this guy who looks big and maybe he could be mean. But he wasn't mean. And so that was my first meeting with Jimmy, and I didn't run into him again, I think, at least for several months.
How did I meet Jimmy? I believe the first time I met Jimmy was at Sam Tannehill and Cheryl Francis's house. We were all friends back then, and they were having a party, and Jimmy was going to roast a goat. And I had never had a whole goat before, and Jimmy liked doing that type of thing. So that was the first time I met him. And I think it's kind of hard not to miss him. You know, when you first meet Jimmy, you know who everyone's talking about. You know, people will describe Jimmy as he was just kind of a large, muscular, wild guy who wore like army boots and you know, these leather jackets. He drove a Unimog, you know, and he had a Jeep and liked to talk about, you know, crazy things and shooting guns and hunting chanterelles. And so he was this larger than life character.
I actually met Jimmy in before the wine industry. So I know him. I was living in Eugene at the time, and Jimmy was dating Lynn Madoff, who has the clothing designer in Portland. She's Lena Mendoya, and her brother Lee Madoff, who was the distiller and great friend of mine, Lee Madoff. And so I got to know him a little bit then, and oddly enough, we both worked for the McMiniman Company. And so I got to know him a little bit through that time.
Well, I think I met him peripherally to begin with. I was over at Willa-Kinsey, where Jimmy was, I think, the assistant winemaker under Laurent Montelieu. And you know, he was out there doing something in the background kind of when I was talking to Laurent, and so I saw him and then just kind of was introduced to him, I think, by Laurent. But I was intrigued by, at the time they had this thing they called Bigfoot, which was just a punch down machine that you actually set on the tank, and then it was kind of programmed. You just left it there for 20 minutes and it kind of did its thing, so it was kind of unmanned, and that was somewhat unique at the time. Turned out to be a little bit of a pain in the ass, I think. I don't know if they use it anymore, but I don't think I was there specifically to look at that, but that was certainly caught my attention. I think Jimmy actually showed us, you know, Laurent asked him to move it to a different tank. This was not during fermentation or during harvest. It was, you know, afterwards, so the tanks were empty and it was just sitting there, but Jimmy got up and kind of unclamped it and moved it to another tank, and just to demonstrate how to move it on. So that was my first time, I think, that I had met him.
How did I meet Jimmy? So I had worked, right? I was in the industry, and you're cellar rat, right? And it's a pretty proud title that you wear when you're in that. You're working for some great places. Who knows what they think about you? But amongst yourselves, right, you have this street cred because you're out doing this. And so Jimmy was a combination, right? It's a slow build between going to technical seminars and seeing Jimmy and Jay and Tad Seastad and you know, we're just that group, and it's like, oh, hey man, what's going on? And after a while, you know each other, and then you see each other at parties, and you drink and you do whatever, you know, shenanigans, and you got a little bit of ammo on each other. But Jimmy and I had this funny bond because I'd been in Lithuania, in the former Soviet Union, and so he had spent some time in Slavic countries and liked to drink some vodka and maybe get up some trouble and, come on, Jim, let's go beat up some Russians, or, you know, whatever the thing was. So we had this kind of this innate thing that was cool. Yeah, good guy. You know, like any, you know, relationship you have with somebody, it starts and it's this and that, and then, oh yeah, I like hanging out with this guy. And then, you know, it's part of a group, and then it rolls forward, yeah.
He was just a great person. I mean, he could be happy, he could be stubborn, he could be depressed, he could be really involved or interested and obsessed with something, like when we found out about Unimogs and wanted to get involved in that. And I mean, he was just such a personality that everything he did, from the smallest thing to the biggest thing, he had a feeling for. So whether that made him happy or sad, he had that emotion and that passion and that drive to do something. And so it was fun being around him. I didn't honestly have a lot of friends once I moved back to Oregon and had our second kid. It was really more about taking care of the kids and stuff. And so meeting somebody like Jimmy and having that presence and going around with them, and everywhere he went, everybody knew him, and it was just a kind of an awe-inspiring experience for me. And it was really neat, and I think it shaped the way I looked at other people and friends.